Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to the second episode of the Revival, Reflection, and Ramadan webinar series. This is the second episode of the webinar series brought to you by the Ramadan 10 Project, and the aim of this webinar series is to help us best prepare for Ramadan and reap the rewards of Ramadan. Before we introduce our panelists today, I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Rabon and Sheikh Hitam Tamim for Friday's webinar. It was a success, and I want to thank you all for your questions. Moving on, the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss economics and how economics affects Islam and how Islam affects economics. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Dr. Mehmet Asutay. Dr. Mehmet is a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Political Economy and Finance. He's a director of MSc Islamic Finance Program, and he's a director Center for Islamic Economics and Finance at the Durham University. Welcome, Dr. Mehmet. Islam, how are you doing?
It's a pleasure to be. Alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah, I'm very well. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, we're good. We're good. How are you finding this current climate we're in at the moment? Are you well? Are your family well?
Well, alhamdulillah, we are well, but it is an entirely different news setting for everyone, including us at home. We, both of us, myself and my wife, we travel a lot for work purposes. Of course, that has to be avoided now. And so trying to fit into our new lifestyle, and also the anxiety in terms of what will happen after this, because the expectation is that perhaps a new political economy will emerge. But at the same time, this gives us a good opportunity in terms of reflecting, because I feel that we as the powerful ones have been oppressing whatever available around us, all the stakeholders, whether it is land, labor, even capital itself, we have been exploiting heavily, including environment and the humans. And perhaps it's a healing time for all of us. And perhaps it's a time to reflect, and therefore the importance perhaps this program, since the Ramadan is coming, which is an important reflection time. But this event in itself also, it's a major reflection opportunity for all of us, not only for Muslims, but all the humanity. Perhaps we have to reconsider our position in the world, who we are, and our responsibilities in relation to all the stakeholders around us. And perhaps therefore realizing the whole Khalifa identity of human being responsible, and therefore within that responsible, how we can perhaps continue after this events, how we can help the healing process on earth for human, because humans are being slaughtered every day in different parts of the world, or terribly, unfortunately, exploited through different processes, including capitalist process, environment, everything around us, unfortunately. Therefore, it is hope. Let's hope that it is a resetting process, and we can move into a better, perhaps a new political economy in which at least some of the normative understanding of Islam can prevail. Let's pray for that.
Inshallah. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce co-host today, Sarah, who's from the Ramadan 10 Project. Assalamu alaikum, Sarah. How are you doing?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for that introduction. Doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. How are you finding this whole process?
I have to say that the insight that Dr. Mehmet has just given is definitely a new one, and one that I'm definitely be thinking about from now on. But otherwise, alhamdulillah, getting used to the new normal, and yeah, trying to make the most out of the sun whilst being indoors. That's about it, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So with that, I just want to start off with the first question for Dr. Mehmet. And the question is how does Islam affect our interaction with the financial system? As you've mentioned, we have in the Western world, especially a capitalist system, which you have touched on, that is being exploited. Can you please give me your opinion on that, and how, again, the current pandemic will also impact on that?
I think the very easy answer I can give you by saying that, look, we have Islamic banks and financial institutions. We have entirely a new process and giving the necessary fatwas. So our engagement with the financial system has been sorted out. It's all halal and available for us. But I'm not going to do that because I'm not happy with whatever available around us, even within the Islamic version of it. Because the whole Islamic notion of what we understand economy, iqtisad, unfortunately, in the last 30, 40 years has been relegated to our engagement with the financial sector. However, our major problem in Muslim communities in the UK, as well as in the larger Muslim world, as well as for the humanity, is not necessarily the financial part of the story, is the economic empowerment, whether people have stakes and whether therefore engaging with financial sector would enable them to have stakes. That's very much the question that we have to look into. Because when we look at the whole objective within Islamic moral economy we define is the emancipation of individual and the empowerment of individual. And when I refer to individual, I'm not referring to neoclassical understanding of methodological individual, but as human being. That distinction is important because for us to understand, because Islam rejects that individualism as a methodology. And therefore, from that perspective, when we look at emancipation on the one hand and empowerment on the other hand, when we look at the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, for instance, when with the revelation of the Quran, the emancipation process was there, but the empowerment was not possible because the Qurayshi political economy was not allowing that. They were controlling the capital, they were controlling the economy. One way or another, they were okay giving up the gods that they were protecting, but giving up the power of economy wasn't something that they were prepared to accept. On the other hand, Islam was suggesting that all the resources in the society has to be made available for people. So therefore, that created a whole clash, and therefore Prophet ﷺ moved into another society, a neutral society, to create the whole Islamic political economy. And when we look at the first thing that he suggested in terms of the relationship between Ansar and the Muhajirun is the partnership, is the sharing economy. So it wasn't, can you look after your Muhajirun brothers or sisters? It wasn't looking after. It was immediately a sharing economy based political economy, saying that you are partner now. Okay, it's not looking after, it's not charitable giving, is entirely constituting that political economy is an important part. And therefore, emancipation with the La ilaha illallah, that emancipation law, rejecting, that's the emancipation process, and then immediately responding to in constituting a new society. That's the illallah part that exists, what Allah says exists. And therefore that emancipation and empowerment in terms of the objective function of Islamic moral economy is an important thing to understand in relation to the recent, not recent, but in the last 30, 40 years with the essentialization of finance. Because finance, unfortunately, prevents that emancipation. It ties people, it makes them debted, and creating that process, creating an debted individual is something that has been produced by the financial system. Now, if you do that without the interest, and that's the important part I'm missing. If you do without the interest that we are suggesting and we are doing currently with Islamic banking, still you are not empowering people. You are just doing the similar transactions, but in order to fit the Islamic normativeness, you are going around and creating structures to overcome that. And therefore, the whole financial engagement and creating Islamic financial structure is not helping us in order to reach that empowerment that we are looking for. Because at the end of the day, what happens, either the basic question I will always ask in my classes or the conferences, whether we think whatever available around us is a privilege or it is a right. Because if it is right, if you are thinking that it is a right, then it goes into economics understanding, neoclassical economics, that brings us to the efficiency and etc. However, if, as Islam suggests, if it is privilege, and Quran tells us that it's a privilege, then we are entirely in a different paradigm. So that paradigm requires, therefore, how we can create that sharing economy, and therefore through that sharing economy, how we can consider finance as part of that process. And therefore, rather than the financial, because financial has a different connotation in the modern world, it is hegemony of the finance, hegemony of capital. However, financing is just the instrumentalization of the money capital. Islam instrumentalizes it. Therefore, the whole prohibition of interest or riba is not only creating structures going around, but it is directly defining what is capital and what is the role of capital. So it tells us, by prohibiting that, it tells the capital and capital owner, look, you cannot be hegemonic, because it was the Quraysh, the society of Quraysh was the hegemony. They were accepting the idea of giving up their gods, but they couldn't give up their capital. So therefore, the whole idea with the prohibition of capital, overcoming hegemony in the society between different stakeholders, and therefore how we can establish a society based on equity, fairness, justice. And these are the important elements of Islamic moral economy. Now, of course, when we look at the practice of Islamic finance in relation to that, you could see that it works entirely within the hegemony of capital. And therefore, the riba, the whole objective with the riba prohibition, unfortunately, it is not working to that extent. But the question, of course, coming back to that, I guess you have this amazing normative understanding of the world, and unfortunately, this current reality that we have, it directly shows that the hegemony of capital and the right understanding of individual, the narcissism, the whole everything is mine, it has to be mine, I have to maximize, the maximizing individual, that methodological individual has brought us to this reality that we have today. And therefore, the whole idea of how the privilege understanding that everything is from Allah, everything is a privilege, and therefore how we can deal with that, how we can create that sharing economy is of course the current political economy would not allow us. And therefore, within the existing political economy, the Muslims have to exist. Therefore, the whole engagement, the halal engagement with the existing structure has been creation of Islamic banks and financial institutions within the capitalist economic understanding, within the definition of capital by capitalism, but using Islam and the prohibition of riba as an instrument to overcome that. That has been the solution, and that we are. But the consequences of that, unfortunately, has not empowered individual. For instance, when we look at in Malaysia, when Islamic finance emerged in the early 1970s, the whole idea was to empower the real or the original people of the land, as they call it, Bumiputras. And today, after 40 years, mashallah, Malaysia has done fantastic in Islamic finance. Nearly 30% of the financial system is Islamic. The question, what happened to the life of the Bumiputras? They are still in the periphery, they are still poor, and they still do not have access. So the equation hasn't changed, but we have created new elites through Islam or through Islamic finance. And therefore, our engagement with the financial system, unfortunately, because of the hegemonic nature of capitalism, we are squeezed into this. But within that, rather than being conservative and engaging in a conservative manner, we have become more capitalist than the capitalists within the Islamic finance. And we have created structures, unfortunately, just replicating what is happening there. And therefore, yes, perhaps we have to engage because it is inevitable, but at least we have to be conservative within that understanding how much we need to engage. And rather than going into different structures and different avenues to engage further in a very liberal manner with the capitalist economy or the neoliberal economy, we have to consider the Islamic normativeness within that extent. And therefore, the Islamic normativeness, the whole sharing economy, the whole idea of the iqtisad, that's the establishing balance in the society. That's the meaning of iqtisad, as opposed to economics, rather than efficiency, equity, justice. These are important part, but we are just doing the lip servicing rather than essentializing such qualities and normativeness in the Islamic banking and finance sector in our applications. Unfortunately, what I call it, and therefore has written on it, the social failure of Islamic banking in relation to the normative understanding.
So the question that is begged immediately from what you're just talking about now is, as an individual now, how can I be conservative, as you're putting it, in my interactions with the financial system, and how do I make my interactions within this all-encompassing capitalist system that we're in, how can we make it rooted in the original foundations of emancipation and empowerment that you were talking about? How can we achieve that as individuals?
Yes. I think when we look at, for instance, when I think it was 1990s, referring to the Muslims in Europe, they should, because in most of the Muslim world, one way or another, Islamic banks and financial institutions were emerging, so responding to the demand for Sharia compliant Islamic finance. And that's the important distinction, because what we have around us is Sharia compliant, but not Islam based. So if you use the Fuzzy theory understanding from 1 to 100, it is somewhere there, but the 100 will be the Islamic. So with the Sharia compliant understanding, in most of the Muslim world, the Islamic finance were emerging, but in Europe wasn't. And therefore, European Fiqh Academy decided, gave fatwa that for the need of individual Muslims, you need to have a house. And therefore, you can borrow from conventional banks because it wasn't available Sharia compliant to respond to the need. That's the zarura need. There's a need, and that need has to be responded, because otherwise Muslim societies and communities would be undermined. They were constantly. Therefore, they gave the fatwa to respond to that. Of course, then in different structures emerged in the UK as well as in other European countries to respond to that need in recent years. But that, when I was referring to that conservativeness, it is very much within that understanding, how individual behavior, how much, for instance, we have been contributing to whole capitalist system, okay, with our consumption patterns, for instance, and even the whole halal market idea, okay? Of course, you can easily list everything that we have around us as a need. For instance, holiday is a need, but what makes that a need, okay? How that need emerges, what's the source of that need? So then, because when you define need, then you have to provide a halal version of it. But the halal version of everything does not imply that it is embedded in the qualities of the Muslim society or the Muslim normativeness. In other words, by doing halal holiday, perhaps we are undermining the good quality of life as a family life. For instance, when I look at the Muslim world in the patterns, holiday patterns, everyone prefers, at least domestically, to go on holiday during Eid. However, Eid is an essential part of the social formation of Islam to establish that community understanding, living together, and the bond, the importance of family, and etc. Then what you see, everyone all over the place, they are on holiday, that spirit immediately shifted. So what is, because we are responding to capitalist needs. So the needs have been formulated by someone somewhere, and then it has been imposed. So how we can reject that, how we can create those rejective understanding of, whatever available around us, it doesn't imply that it is a real need, but it is constituted need. In other words, the economics, in economics would tell you that every supply will produce its demand. That's the economic rule, okay? If you have studied economics from the first year, they will teach you that every supply will produce a demand. But we do not look at the source of that supply. We immediately try to formulate the Islamic version of that. And that's the process, unfortunately, we are contributing in individual life. But beyond that, of course, institutions such as Islamic bank and financial institutions, they have created toxic structures, which makes and creates further debt. But the whole idea, one of the principles of Islamic moral economy when it defines Islamic finance is the prevention of debt, because we know that debt is considered to be one of the curses. And therefore, when we look at the Hadith tradition, we could see very strong argument against debt, okay? Because debt undermines the dignity of human, as recently Pope in Vatican stated that in a fantastic statement. The same wisdom it is in Islam, because unless therefore the tradition of the Prophet did not allow person to be buried until the debt is paid. It's considered a curse in itself. But we are creating debtness through our Islamic financial system and through our own individual activities. And therefore, when I refer to conservatism, okay, we cannot avoid. But then there are areas which we can avoid, but we are propagating those areas, okay? Such as I always refer, when you go to Kaaba, what you have now, around Kaaba, you have towers. Okay, so it's not accessible to ordinary people. You have to be rich to have that accessibility. Okay, and not only that, you have a clock tower now. Okay, Kaaba and the whole process of Hajj or Umrah is supposed to be two important things is important. One, forgetting the place, forgetting the time. You cannot forget the place because you have amazing shopping centers and the tall buildings around you. You cannot forget the time because time. So it becomes a product. It has to be packed. Okay, it's a packaged program. So therefore, that conservative attitude, which could enable us, for instance, at least in Kaaba, in the Umrah, in the Hajj, to forget to embed ourselves into that spirituality, it is not allowed because we have this building. And then the social justice bit, if you are rich, you can have access to those buildings and you can have rooms there you can look at. And for many years, I have been talking against those towers in Kaaba, but then I realized that I have been propagating because a lot of people who didn't hear before that, including my friends, they started buying time sharing from those buildings, okay? So these are the dilemmas that we have around us.
Okay. Just a question regarding what you mentioned earlier with regards to the Quraysh and how they failed to give up the power. Now, in terms of modern day society, there's been a lot of talk, especially across the media and especially the financial media, about the inequality gap and how we have the 1% versus the 99%. If we lived in an ideal world where people were conservative, people did share and people did empower others through partnerships, does that mean that the 1% would have to give up their wealth, or would there be another way around this?
I think we have to look into the whole equation, as I mentioned, the whole objective of life, because that 1% has that power because the system has created an hegemonic relationship. It has given the power to the capital. Capital has the power, therefore it can determine the rest. Okay. However, Islam rejects all the hegemony in the society. And therefore, the prohibition of interest is particularly important, not because it's a financial issue, it's a political economic issue. Unfortunately, including our Sharia scholars, they only consider it as only an instrument of overcoming riba or the interest in the financial. No, it's a political economy of constituting a particular society, what we call Islamic social formation. Because the hegemonic power was in favor of capital during the time, the prohibition of capital implied that, look, your power, you cannot have power over other stakeholders. So capital cannot be powerful over labor. And of course, we do not, within Islamic model, we do not call it labor because labor is, again, commodified version of human. Okay, that's not acceptable either. So it has power over human, it has power over the environment, it has power on land. However, it has to go into the production process in equal footing. Okay, and therefore, however, when we look at those of you who have studied economics, you would know from the first year, everything is around capital. We determine everything. When you look at the growth theories, is everything about capital. So in the growth theory, the most popular Kaldor growth theory, for instance, why the output is equal K and L. K is the capital, L is the labor. K, the capital will get alpha, and whatever left over from alpha, L will get 1 minus alpha. So you are defining L, labor, as a function of K, because K is the dominant power. Okay, so the objective of Islam is to overcome that. Therefore, we define the Islamic society as the Ihsani society, as the whole idea of creating that good society. Ihsan is very much the excellence in terms of establishing equilibrium in the society. Okay, and therefore, Ihsan is an amazing concept around which we articulate. Ihsan is very much considered as an individual quality only. No, it's a governance quality, establishing equality in the not equality, equilibrium in the society. So those of you, the one person who has a lot, they are expected in the Ihsani society to enable the others who do not have to come to the similar level. Those who have capital, they have to look into the structures, because that structure, the Ihsani society structure, would not allow capital to have that hegemonic power to exploit the others to have that much of money, because the political economy constituted in such a way, from the production, it has to be distributed. Now, what you have, these guys are saying that they are doing philanthropy. They're exploiting, then they generate because of their power, they exploit the profit that they generate, then they say that they are making philanthropy, they are distributing. No, the question is, when we go into the production function, Y and L, as I mentioned, here, all the stakeholders have to be listed, and none of them can be function to another. Everything that we have as a stakeholder, land, human capital, environment, society, has to be part of that process from the production function when we define the production, not the post-production. And therefore, in such a society of equilibrium, then you wouldn't create that huge differences in the wealth level. And therefore, it is very interesting, if I'm not mistaken, it is the time of Sayyidina Umar, I think, the land of Sham, the Syria, unfortunately, it is being burned now. When it was taken over, it is the rule, it is the Islamic injunction that has to be distributed among the people who participated into the campaign. But that time, that ruling of the Quran was not allowed. Booty was not distributed. Okay, even Bilal, Sayyidina Bilal, was opposing that, because he was in the campaign and he couldn't get the land he was deserving from the booty. And the justification was that it was huge land, the campaign included very few people, it would create few people, giving them the opportunity space to be terribly rich compared to the others. And therefore, in order not to disturb the equilibrium in the society, the land that was acquired through that campaign was not distributed as a booty, not to disturb the political economy of equilibrium. Ihsan. The Ihsani society, therefore, the excellence in terms of articulated as establishing that equilibrium in the society. And therefore, we are talking about the equilibrium in the society, how Ihsan through Ihsan, those who have knowledge can help the others to reach to the similar level of knowledge. And I'm not using the word same, but similar, how we can help the others to empower those who have capital, those who have labor, and etc. So you're talking about entirely different political economy. I know I'm talking about a lot of normativeness, but current conditions that we are living now is an indication that the system is not working. And therefore, we have to go back to this equilibrium society, how we can establish those equilibrium, that equilibrium that is needed in the society between different stakeholders. How can one person such as Amazon can have $180 billion in 20, 30 years wealth. No one can explain that at the expense and the exploitation of people working. We hear all those stories, those people who work for Amazon, how they are treated, for instance. That cannot be. And then that person going and doing philanthropy, that's not acceptable. And therefore, when we look at the equation, everyone's right has to be accepted. And therefore, it is the society of equilibrium. And an important position there, of course, the right of the society, such as whatever your production function is, Islam doesn't define that. It gives us particular normative understanding how we can constitute that. But one thing, Islam tells us that whatever the capital structure in the society, the geography of the society, what kind of production will be in that society, the right of the society is directly determined by Allah through zakat. So the right of the capital, the right of the human, the right of the labor, land, and etc., within the justice and the normative morality of Islam, left to that society to determine, establish that. But Allah directly in the Quran determines the right of the society. So zakat is not a charity. It is the right of the society to be returned to society as a residual from the production function. And these are important concepts for us to consider.
Thank you for that.
I hope that responds.
Yeah, that was a very well in-depth response for that. I'm going to ask two questions, and you have touched on them slightly. The first one is there such a thing as a halal Islamic mortgage? And the second one is, how moral is Islamic finance?
Okay, as I mentioned before, the world unfortunately has imposed a particular political economy. Okay? And this is not new, unfortunately. Since 18th, 19th century, the market economy imposed slowly on the entire world, and the last, of course, official imposition took place in 1979 with Washington Consensus. All the societies were forced into neoliberal policies, including UK. Those of you, of course, you guys are very young, you wouldn't remember, but in the UK as well, there was a huge reaction against neoliberal policies, which were undermining the right of different stakeholders in the society, including environment and importantly, labor, for instance, okay? Because those policies, the market-based economic policies, enshrined with the 1979 Washington Consensus neoliberalism, entirely established financial sector and the capital as the only hegemony. The growth of the economies and societies could be achieved only with that. And therefore, looking at from that perspective, what we call disembeddedness. In other words, economy is not an organic reality anymore, produced by the societies, the realities of the societies, because religion, culture, and etc., people are embedded into such value system. And the economy that they produce out of that, what we call therefore is an embedded, is an organic economy. However, with the emergence of capitalism and imposition of neoliberalism, market economy imposed on every society. Now, therefore, what we call disembeddedness. So market does not represent the values and the realities on the ground, okay? And therefore, after 1979, even a small developing country in Africa, they had to open up their economies, financialize their financial system, liberalize their financial system and economy, because market was pushing that. But their reality was not accepting that, so the difficulties and accept. But this is an ongoing process. The disembeddedness has become the reality, and therefore the emergence of Islamic economics at the same time in 1960s, we see that there are a lot of movements to re-embed. What Karl Polanyi, those of you who have interest to look at the economic history and the political economy, Karl Polanyi's amazing work in 1941-44, The Great Transformation. He would tell us how the moral economy society is with the imposition of market economy became disembedded society. And therefore, he would call the emergence of different protective movements, including labor unions and other civil society organizations, as rescuing process, rescuing land, labor, and capital. So Islamic economics emergence in the modern times after the classical period and colonial period, it is very much re-embedding process, how we can re-embed economy in the value system of Islam, rather than economy being itself economics, how it can be iqtisad, representing the values of Islam and the societies in which it is operating. And that was the whole project, reconstituting the Muslim societies. But of course, global economy did not allow that. Therefore, the only solution for the people of the time, they were propagating the idea how we can Islamize the petrodollars. Because petrodollars, 73, huge amounts of money, 76, and they couldn't suggest. And I talked a lot and worked with the founding fathers, as I call them. They said, look, 1970s, you couldn't go to any Muslim country and talk to the leaders of the time saying that, look, we are proposing an alternative economic system based on Islam, okay? None of them would accept that. But because the money was there and they wanted to have halal earning on that, that was easy. So therefore, they proposed Islamic banking. Okay, so they then, therefore, Islamic banking emerged through that process, halalization of the emerged capital. However, that is 1970, the first Islamic bank, 1970, 74, 75. However, there is one important example as well. 1963, an individual Muslim from Egypt goes to Germany, does his PhD there, very much affected by the small banks and the cooperatives type of constitution. And therefore, when he goes back to Egypt, he established a small saving bank called Mitgam. 1963 is a social banking, is a social credit union. And with that, the objective is to empower people. So those who have certain savings brings there, and then he offered them as an Islamic structures for ordinary artisans, small businesses to empower. And therefore, the Egyptian regime during the time, they closed it because it was empowering, okay? But unfortunately, that model in 1975, because it was capital-dominated understanding through the petrodollars, they opted, rather than such a model, they went to what? Capital-dominated understanding of commercial Islamic banking. So the commercial Islamic banking, that's the reality we have in front of us. And it is based on the hegemonic power of capital, unfortunately, Islamic banking. And therefore, it is what we call, it is shareholder value maximization. It is not stakeholding understanding. So like any other bank, it is shareholder maximization regardless of what happens to other stakeholders in the process. So that's the reality we have, and that's the political economy. However, Muslims want to do things, at least instrumentally, halal, because morally, you cannot reach to that halal, but at least instrumentally, how you can reach halal. Therefore, Islamic banks respond to that instrumental morality, but not substantive morality. The substantive morality requires a particular world system in which capital is not dominant, for instance. But Islamic banks, capital dominant. But on the other hand, you need a mortgage, and therefore you need how instrumentally at least that can be available, because as part of identity, as part of the whole belief system, you cannot engage with. And therefore Islamic banks provide that shortcut for us to instrumentalize our morality and normativeness, unfortunately, and therefore have accessibility to the resources that we have in front of us. And having said that, I should tell you that those of you familiar with Marxism, Marxists hates not capitalists, but socialists, because socialists created an alternative structures for capitalism to survive by borrowing certain ideas from okay, Marxism. And therefore, the Marxist expectation of the collapse of capitalism did not happen because they would say that the socialists, unfortunately, they did the middle linking, okay? So this is the reality that we have as well. Islamic
Drawing on
banks
from this,
does that link, yeah.
I mean, what you've said is, I think, a very holistic understanding of the financial system and its relation to Islam and Muslimin and how we should be interacting within it. And there's definitely a lot there for us to think about, especially this concept of instrumental morality, where we're doing things that are instrumentally Islamic or moral in this way, but they don't access right at the core of the two concepts you said right at the beginning. And yes. I think that's really interesting, a lot to think about there. And the question that we can draw on from that is, now that we're coming up to Ramadan, how should this affect our approach to spending in Ramadan, our approach to interacting with the financial system in Ramadan? Especially, it's a month that's rooted in charity. It's a month that's, it's all about community and being there for each other and etc. But do you feel that Ramadan has, in and of itself, been commercialized? Has it become, has it lost its meaning in the same way that the general overall Islamic economic system has?
And that's fantastic, because an important part of this moral economy, the Islamic moral economy, when we go to the Quran, what you see is always giving up. There is no accumulation, because in Islam rejects accumulation. Therefore, the whole riba is prohibited, because riba is related, okay, the interest is related hegemony of capital. Hegemony refers to what? Accumulation, when you accumulate. And therefore, like, there are certain people out there, they would say that Muslim world did not develop because they couldn't accumulate, they couldn't establish corporations. Well, the political economy of Islam, deriving from Quran, against accumulation. Bank is a product of accumulation. Corporation is a political economy of accumulation. Mm-hmm. So Islam rejects accumulation, okay? The other things were, I was recently discussing in a platform, they were saying that, look at Dubai, it's flourishing, amazing, but they didn't have in the past. Now the question is, of course, yes, flourishing, but in what terms? Because in the past, okay, the society is of course interactive, but you didn't have one hegemonic political economy imposing to the rest. Blending was a reality, organically was happening. One society, one civilization was benefiting from other. I mean, if you go to Istanbul, you look at the mosques, those beautiful mosques, in reality, in their architectural structure, it is the Roman church, okay? So blending was a reality. Or if you go to Damascus, if anything left, you would see the mosque is a Christian inheritance, but as a structure, and Muslims have developed that. And therefore, blending was historically a reality. But currently, what you have, one political economy dominating and making you a slave of that political economy. So you have to fit into that. That is our major problem. And therefore, accumulation is not there. Islam rejects accumulation. Therefore, any accumulative oriented political economy is nothing to do with Islam. And therefore, when we look at the very traditional moral structures within Islamic finance, which is unfortunately, which are not necessarily utilized by Islamic banks because they are not profitable within the existing capitalist system, or because they are risky within the existing structures, but these are the equity structures, because equity structure does not accumulate in favor of one, but it's a partnership, it's a sharing economy, okay? So therefore, giving, as a result of that, we mentioned ihsan. Ihsan is an important part of it. What is the objective function of individual? Economics will tell you that individual, because it's based on the rightist understanding, right understanding, maximize your utility, maximize your wealth, maximize your profit, and etc. Islam, however, is based on what? The privileged understanding. Whatever you have around you, it's given to you by Allah, therefore it's amana. And therefore you have to return that amana. Okay, therefore zakat is not your charity, it's not your generosity, it's this right of the society that has to be given to the society. So therefore that ihsan, so that makes it individual function. So what is the individual objective function in Islamic moral economy? Is the falah, reaching to that salvation. And that salvation brings you the Ihsani society. So that salvation requires, therefore, the giving up. And therefore, in the Quran, there isn't any verse that suggests you to accumulate. It's always spend in the way of Allah, spend in the way of Allah. There isn't anything else, okay? Because it would consider this world as temporary, and within that temporarity, how we can reach falah, and through that, how we can create the Ihsani society. Therefore, Ramadan is an amazing exercise platform for this political economy, so that every year, 1 month, we can remind ourselves, we can go back to default, how that political economy in the remaining of the 11th month can be can continuously sustain, rather than just doing everything in 1 month. That will be a terribly secular understanding. So Ramadan is just a reminding that the remember the 11 months, you have to continue, you have to go back to the default. So the giving up process has to be there. What is the giving up process? Whatever you like, whatever holding you to this world, everything. And therefore in the Quran, the references to your wealth, your children, your life, and etc. holding you back, is that holding you back, the freeing individual, emancipation. As I mentioned, emancipation is how we can emancipate and free ourselves. Whatever we consume, whatever we have, whatever the wealth we have is holding us. And therefore Ramadan reminds us we have to give up. That giving up is an important part, because the objective is to becoming, how we can reach to that falah position. Is a becoming process, how much we can do in the way of Allah. And therefore Ramadan is important within that. And even when we look at the tradition of Prophet Abraham, for instance, giving up his son, because he gave up everything, but Allah was telling him, there is still something holding you. You are not emancipated still. Of course, Allah didn't want to get his son slaughtered, but that was a lesson that you have to give up whatever it is there holding you back. Okay, the emancipation. And therefore Ramadan is an amazingly emancipatory process through accelerating that giving up process, giving up whatever we have, what is holding us, and sharing whatever we have. But it is not only in the month of Ramadan, it's an exercise to continue throughout the 11 months. But when we look at, unfortunately, the process, Ramadan has been terribly commodified in the process. It is commodified to that extent that everything that around us, of course, the capitalist system has been chipping on that as well. Now, when we go to the supermarkets, the halalness or Eid and etc., Happy Ramadan and all those, of course, reminding us we have to consume more. Ramadan is not deferment of the consumption, which we are doing in the Muslim society. When you look at the data, for instance, the consumption pattern in the Muslim societies during Ramadan, it increases terribly. There's a shift, there's a break always. And therefore, those of us involved in macroeconomic analysis, we would look at the trends, and we would, in order to overcome the seasonal impact, we have to use certain models to get to minimize the impact of the Ramadan impact, because it creates a shift. I mean, recently I was talking to a colleague in the Middle East, one of the countries. I said, how is the supply chain going on? He said, it's fantastic, because Ramadan is coming up, everyone piled up anyway. Okay, so that's the, unfortunately, the deferment. Either we defer to immediately after the iftar, until the sahur, we go crazy, or we deferred for the rest of the years. But the whole idea is, no, it's an exercise of giving up, and how that can be sustained over the 11 months, remain 11 months. And therefore that giving up, in order to remind us that giving up process, Ramadan is an amazing, amazing feeling, amazing opportunity for us to consider the whole moral economy, but not only in the month of Ramadan, but throughout the year. And not only giving up to defer, we have to give it up, not defer it. And therefore the whole ihsani, establishing that equilibrium in the society through Ramadan, how we can achieve that, we have to look into. And therefore it goes back to the individual qualities very much. And when I deliver lectures, people immediately jump to conclusion to the system understanding. I fully support system understanding, but systems are constituted by individuals. If the individual qualities are not developed, unfortunately, even if you bring revolutions, you will not be able to sustain that, because the organic development has to come through the bottom-up process. How, as an individual, we can develop ourselves so that we should be able to reach to that quality.
Yeah, thank you for that in-depth. I mean, are we in danger that Ramadan has already been commercialized? Just as I was, in sort of anticipation of this webinar, I was doing some research, and a lot's been made of the fact that in UK, especially in the United Kingdom, especially, it's the third biggest calendar event after Christmas and Easter, with £200 million spent sort of in the days and weeks leading up to Ramadan and the week after, and during Ramadan and the week after. What is your opinion on that? Can we reverse that? And how do we prevent ourselves from falling into the dangers of commercializing Ramadan and Eid like the Western civilized world has done with Easter and Christmas?
Yes, certainly. I mean, therefore, the whole moral economy understanding, I'm reminding to myself and everyone is listening, that the whole idea is how we can avoid going into that trap, because everything that we have and the global political economy constituted that trap, that everything is commercialized, everything is commodified, whatever we have around us. And therefore, even as I mentioned, the Hajj process, the Umrah has been commodified. Because if you are rich, you can go and stay in those towers and etc. And when we look at the statistics, as you referred, in the larger Muslim world as well, the consumption expenditures are huge. And I have to, again, remind the amount of oppression that we are exerting on the resources that Allah created around us and gave us as a privilege, as an amana. Unfortunately, that oppression is referring back to us. We have the environmental crisis around us. We have this global pandemic around us, global financial crisis, and etc. everything. So it is because we are not listening to the message that we have in the Quran or in the other traditions as well, similar messages in the other traditions, whether in Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and etc. Similar modest lifestyle has been suggested in everywhere. But unfortunately, the market forces are taking over us. We all have become terribly subservient to the market forces, despite the fact that we might declare our positions in different ways, but at the end of the day, market determines what we want to do. And therefore, Ramadan has become part of that. Unfortunately, everything is commercialized during Ramadan. Even the prices increase. When you look at the prices of food, for instance, in the Muslim countries, inflation is increasing because everyone wants to exploit that, because people's tolerance level for spending is increased, and they want to respond to their thirst for eating more, because they defer everything, as well as, of course, the whole idea of now after the Ramadan, the Eid, the parties, and etc. So rather than going through that process of, I have to grow, I have to develop myself, the whole tazkiyah process. And when I grow, when I increase my quality of life, that has to be through the giving up of what I consume, what is tidying up myself to this world, rather than developing such as understanding and considering that my growth should not be at the expense of other stakeholders in the society. Unfortunately, we became consumers in the process. And therefore, that consumption patterns in the Muslim societies, because at least in the Western societies with a strong civil society, certain awareness on environmental issues, certain awareness on labor issues, and etc., has been recognized and acknowledged. But in the Muslim world, unfortunately, our Muslim communities, even when we look at, unfortunately, that recognition is not there as well, because you don't have strong civil society. And therefore, people are left to the realities of the market economy. I remember one particular tweet, for instance, the Sheikh of Dubai sent a tweet, I think, 4 years ago or something, which I used in my class. He was saying that when he was a small kid, he went to the United States and they went to the Empire State Building with his father, late father, and they looked at the horizon. They said that, when are we going to create such structures in our countries? And then he was giving the photographs from Dubai, Burj, and all those buildings. And he said that how we established that, okay? And strangely, all the Muslims or all the expats was responding to the Sheikh, how great he achieved and etc. Strangely, a young Italian lady picked that up and said that, look, I think you think that you have achieved, but you achieved the dream of others. That's the American dream. Your dream should have been entirely different because your geography, your culture, and etc. So therefore, we don't look at that. We just want to replicate what is available. Market forces tells us, and therefore we follow the dream of the market forces. And the market has taken over Ramadan as well. And therefore, the whole quality, whole giving up process has been given up. The giving up process has been given up in favor of what? We want to grab more. And therefore, I think we have to go back to the learning process. I feel that like the mosques in the UK, the generational gap between the within the mosque community, as well as between the teachers and the learners who cannot deal with such matters, cannot convey such messages relating with the contemporary world and the whole consumption attitude that is developing in the Muslim world. I mean, a few years back, Financial Times ran an amazing article. It was saying that, and that is very much related to our halalness. It was saying that it was giving an example of the small heat in Birmingham. It's a huge street, it's entirely Muslim dominated. Okay, it's a huge road, and you have around 1,000 takeaways. Okay, now they all halal takeaways, but the question, are they really halal? When I say, are they really halal, that was the question in the article. We are not talking about the slaughtering of that animal and serve there. Like, okay, that process is at least instrumentally halal, but the article, and therefore it was useful for me to use in the class as well, was referring to consequences of that process, because we talked about family life. Okay, if everyone eating takeaway, where's the family life? Islamic social formation is around family, that goes, okay? The commodification of the food, okay? The way it is prepared, the way it is served, the whole process, okay? So the meat is halal, the process is not halal, the consequences are not halal. So that's my earlier reference to instrumental morality as opposed to substantive morality. Okay, instrumental morality tells us that the meat served is halal, but unfortunately the consequences it is producing, it is undermining the Muslim society's Muslim lifestyle. And therefore the substantive morality. And therefore going back to Ramadan, instrumentally we are all fasting, okay? But the substantive morality, and therefore I remind myself and everyone that the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, when he refers that there are those who fast, but they have nothing but the thirst and the hunger. And that is very much, we are in that equation. We do fast, so the ritualistic part is achieved, but unfortunately the consequences expected from those rituals are not being achieved. And therefore the transformation in the Muslim society and Muslim communities are not taking place.
I think, again, thanks for that, Dr. Mehmet. The one thing which I picked up from what you said, and also what was said in Friday's webinar, and the key theme is all about using Ramadan as a time and a period of reflection for not just how we should live and think and act and behave during Ramadan, but also for the other 11 months after Ramadan up until the next Ramadan. And I think the one thing what will stick with me is the story you said about the young Italian who spoke to the Sheikh about achieving someone else's dream. And I think that's where I think a lot of this can be rooted down to is people being in touch with their own culture or their faith in our case, and sort of sticking by that and being confident enough to stick by that. So I definitely, those two things will definitely stick with me. I want to just, I'm very conscious of time, and we have a few questions from our viewers. The first one is from Lucas Fernandez, who has asked, can you address the issue of Muslims and their relationship to digital? whether or not it has influenced their financial expenses and their conception of Ramadan or their practices in general.
Okay, one of the, as we see around us, the Sustainable Development Goals all around, every country is subscribed to that. And one of the goals of Sustainable Development Goals is the financial accessibility, financial inclusion. Okay, and through different means. And therefore the digital has become an instrument for all of us to have accessibility to the finance. But the question again, what is the purpose of finance? It is emancipation or slavery. The finance that we have around us, unfortunately, is not emancipating individuals. It is not empowering individuals. And therefore, by financial inclusion, if we are talking about the numbers of people having bank accounts and etc., that would not produce the result that we are looking into. And unfortunately, by having the financial technology, we have given, even expanded the reach of capitalism or the capital to the areas that normally people wouldn't have access or wouldn't become indebted. Because the whole idea of the financialization is indebting the individual. And unfortunately, financial technology has enabled to reach to the places where people would not normally borrow and become indebted, has become indebted. And therefore, when we look at, for instance, microfinance is an amazing project in terms of empowering people. But when it is not properly applied, it creates catastrophe because it creates indebtedness. And therefore, if you look at in India, for instance, one of the largest country where where microfinance is applied extensively, the number of suicide because of people going into debt and they cannot pay back. So our objective is to utilize that as an instrument, how we can empower. But unfortunately, the digitalization has enabled even to extend the capitalism to the places where it could not normally reach. So that's the reality that we have. And therefore, it has facilitated the spending culture more than the others. And therefore, I'm very cautious about financial digitalization. And of course, financial digitalization also comes with the blockchains and also the currencies that we have, cryptocurrencies. And these are, again, further financialization rather than real economy, because Islam relates to real economy. And therefore, however, therefore money doesn't have an instinct value with it. Money is only a transaction. It's just facilitating transactions, intermediation. But of course, with the cryptocurrencies, with the digitalization, now you have money out of which we can make money. And therefore, Islam does not accept in the banking system credit creation. All the Islamic banks are doing that, but normatively it doesn't accept because money cannot be source of wealth creation. So we see all these new technologies, and unfortunately, Islamic circles, including Sharia scholars, have been looking into ways how these digital technologies can be Islamic or cryptocurrencies can be Islamic and etc. But they do not look at the whole normativeness of Islamic moral economy and the consequences of that. And therefore, the Ramadan understanding as well is affected. For instance, one of the good things perhaps, instrumentally good thing at least, it enables us to do our donations, which reach every part of the world. But one important thing, I'm not opposing that, but one important consequence of that, when we look at the Islamic tradition, giving from hand to the person who needs, having that experience, direct experience, the embeddedness, it was considered as an important quality in terms of substantive morality, because directly having that direct relationship with someone who is in need, to be able to locate that and giving a process therefore facilitated. While financial technology enables us to give our charitable givings and through which we can reach to different corners of the world, which is positive, but at the same time, the relationship now, it is only a statistical issue in my statement now. I cannot relate to people who are in that difficulty. I cannot see that, okay? The whole idea of, for instance, sacrifice during the Eid al-Adha, the whole idea of being involved, going through that process of feeling of giving up, okay? But now because we can send over, So we do not experience that. So therefore, in order to develop ourselves and create that discipline in our life, those qualities no longer there because of the digitalization. But on the other hand, of course, the poverty is different parts of the world have to reach there, but we have to look into the pros and the cons of those things, how digital technology is commodifying our practices at the same time. I mean, I haven't seen in the UK, perhaps, I haven't been to many mosques. In Leicester mosque that I go, I didn't see, but when I went to Oslo to a mosque, they had a mission there. You could just touch and pay your sadaqah and zakat and etc. Okay, there are different buttons for zakat, different button for zakat and etc. So that's a fantastic opportunity it provides, but at the same time, I do not have now that direct relationship with that person to remind myself how giving up process is an essential part of Islam. So therefore, we have to look at the benefits and the cost of all these new practices coming around us. I hope that responds.
Thank you for that. I do have a couple of more questions, and this one did catch my eye. Is global warming one of the biggest challenges for Islamic economy? Do we have to put that topic at the top of the interests as well as fairness and equality?
Okay, that's a very important and very relevant issue because it is not only a climate issue. It is the whole political economy that we are talking. The global warming is an environmental issue because the way we produce, the way we consume. So the whole equation, the whole production function, whole modes of production, the way it is constituted in the hegemony of capital and how efficiency can be reached. And that modernity has taught us that you can reach efficiency by maximum exploitation of the resources, whether it is the land, whether it is mining, whether it is labor, whatever you have there, the maximum you can exploit, you can increase your profit, your benefit, and etc. So therefore, that equation has to change, and the quantitative criteria that we have around us directly suggest that it has to change. Now, Islamic moral economy suggesting a particular political economy and particular social structure suggests that economy by definition has to be embedded in the qualities of Islam, the normative qualities of Islam. And that directly suggests us that all stakeholders have to be treated and their rights, such as the Rububiyyah concept, would tell you that Allah created everything, the fitra, Allah has given everything a particular fitra, particular origin to develop, and therefore the fitra is development, to reach to their perfection. So nothing, therefore, can be there to prevent any stakeholders to reach to that perfection, whether that's human, whether that's environment, whether that's land, whatever the resources that we have around us. But unfortunately, the capitalist production, modes of production entirely undermined all at the expense of removing their interest in the equation by hegemonizing capital. And therefore, that equation has to change. Therefore, my earlier criticism to Islamic finance that it is not changing that equation. So we have to come to the Islamic moral economy, the iqtisad understanding, establishing that equilibrium in the society between different stakeholders so that land, human, capital, and other stakeholders can be rescued. Even capital can be rescued from this chain that has been created. And therefore, this climate change issues that we have around us is an entirely an Islamic concern that we have to respond because it is political economy issues. It is enslavement of human that created that process, and therefore freeing ourselves and by rejecting this hegemonic political economy of capital finance, and Islamic moral economy suggests a particular social formation in which the right of environment and along with other stakeholders is totally recognized. And therefore it has to be in our agenda. When I see that Muslim communities, in particular Muslim civil society, is not doing enough because they consider environment is very much liberal left-wing issue. No, if there is a poverty in the world, it relates to the same issue, because the whole political economy is wrong. The whole political economy linked to produce. On one part of the world, it creates poverty. On other parts of the world, it creates environmental catastrophe in other parts, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look at the financial crisis, the flooding that we have, the current climate, the pandemic we have. These are all reminder that the political economy that we have around us, creating all this crisis, systemic crisis, but each time, of course, it benefits from a certain source, sometimes from socialism, sometimes religious qualities, and etc. carries on. But the reality is that that political economy has to change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehmet, for that. We'll give one last quick fire question.
Yeah.
And this one is maybe to give us all some action points with Ramadan coming up. We had somebody who asked about our patterns of spending during Ramadan and how much Islam there is in the way we spend during Ramadan. So off the back of that, can you give us some action points in how, with everything we've just discussed, how should we now be reviving and renewing our intentions when going into spending during the month of Ramadan, and how we can make it more Islamic and more moral?
I think, as I mentioned, in the time of during time of Ramadan, it is not only for Ramadan, but for the entire year. Ramadan is just a platform for us to remind ourselves what we should do in the remaining 11 months, okay? Recharging our batteries for the rest of the month in terms of our giving up process with the objective of reaching that falah, with the objective of establishing that ihsan society, the society of equality. As individual, therefore, it is our own understanding what we have excess that we can share with the rest of the society. Some of us has money that we can share. Some of us has knowledge that we can share. Some of us has the labor power that we can go around, perhaps look after people that who do not have access and reach, help them to reach out food. And some of us has different qualities that each one of us, whatever the excess that we have, or accumulated power that we have, whether it is money, whether it's the labor power, whether it's the knowledge, whatever, how we can share that, not only in Ramadan, but throughout the year. But Ramadan is a good opportunity point to start with. And therefore, when I see, for instance, people very much squeeze everything into Ramadan with the objective of accumulating, and I use the word underline, accumulating their sawab, their return. That's a very capitalistic understanding, okay? Because our duty is not only in Ramadan, throughout the year. We cannot have this accumulation understanding that I want to accumulate my sawab, my returns. That is entirely goes against the whole Islamic idea of ihsan, okay? There are people in need throughout the years, and throughout the year, and therefore we have to reach out to them with whatever we have, okay, whatever the accumulation that we have. And that's an important lesson that I want to draw myself, as well as want to share with you who are listening now. That's when we establish that as a principle in our life, and when it becomes an everyday life. So Ramadan is not just a break from everyday life. It is just a continuation, and that continuation is an important part because, as I mentioned, Islam is a becoming process. Unlike the modernist understanding that you reach, no, we do not know whether we reach or not. And therefore, by accumulating 300 sawab there, 70 sawab there, the return, the whole idea that you will reach, no, it's a becoming process. It is only Allah knows. And therefore, it is between hope and fear, what we can do, with the hope that we'll reach to that, with the fear that we shouldn't fail. And therefore, getting this as a practice for the entire year. When Feridun Attar, for instance, in his fantastic couplet, when he says that, oh Allah, if I'm praying you because I want to be excluded from Jahannam, from hell, please put me into hell. If I'm praying for you because I want to reach Jannah or the paradise, exclude me from Jannah. But I'm praying you for you because of you, then don't avail me the eternal beauty. I think that's the quality that we want to establish, not because we want to have return, 70, 80 return and etc. I can see sometimes people are counting with Caspia, rosary in their hands, how many times they are doing this and that. No, the whole objective is just giving up that idea and become a servant, because the Khalifa individual is a servant individual. And because we talk about the privilege, we have this privilege given by Allah. Whatever the privilege we have to share. It is not the right-based understanding, but it's a privileged understanding. And therefore, we have to go out to reach out people who cannot have certain things that we have, how we can share with them. And the important thing, please don't defer your giving up, okay? It is not eating during the day and then going crazy in the evening. Is not the giving up process is a real, it's not temporary, daily during the daytime issue. So therefore, we have to get into that practice of giving up so that we can reach out, we can establish that Ihsani society by working together. Whatever the contribution that we can make. The Ramadan tent project is providing food for people on the streets. That's an amazing quality, for instance, how we can reach out and develop those qualities. And that is something that we have to work on and share whatever we have. It's a sharing economy. And Ramadan is the best example of that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mehmet. I think you've definitely opened my eyes up and made me think a lot clearer about economics, and especially how it interacts with our faith, our iman. And just touching on what you've said regarding empowerment and also about the accumulation of wealth, it's just reminded me of an ayah from the Quran, from Surah Al-Anfal. I know that your possessions and your children are but a trial, and that surely with Allah is a mighty reward. And I think what you've said there just reminds me of that ayah. So thank you for those reminders. Sarah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's contributed today, whether you've watched and listened, and thank you for your questions and the interaction. Please
just to say that colleagues who have participated, if they want to send me their questions, I'm happy to respond through email.
Thank you, Dr. Mehmet. Yeah, there were a couple of questions which we haven't unfortunately had time to, but we can send them over to you for your response.
I'll be happy.
And thank you. And once again, thank you for everyone watching. Just be aware that we will be having a special one-on-one session this coming Thursday with Omar Soha, who is the CEO and founder of the Ramadan 10 project. So keep an eye out on our social media channels for this. Once again, thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you very much. May Allah make it easy for everyone on these terrible days. Assalamu alaikum.